Hi guys, today we're going to learn about the distributive property and its inverse. The distributive property is one you have probably seen before. If I'm given a problem like this, A times B plus C, I would actually take this A and multiply times B and times C. Remember, A, B, and C can be any number whatsoever. So if I had something like this, I would end up with 32 plus 8, which would give me 40. Yes, I know that the distributive property actually tells us to do parentheses first, but looking at the problem this way shows us that it can actually be done both ways. While looking at this, you can also have the A written on the other side of the parentheses. It still works the same way. A lot of people like to call this the rainbow effect, where you do A times B and A times C. Still get the same basic answer. It also works for subtraction, but notice that when I do this, I end up with a subtraction sign there. And just like before, the A can actually be written at the end. Make sure to get all of these written down, guys. Now, here's a couple of examples where we need to distribute. But it's not always going to be numbers inside those parentheses. This is why it's so important to know how to distribute, because unless you know what x is, you just cannot add x plus 4. So you can take that 3 and multiply times x. Well, guys, let's just think about this logically. 3 times x is just going to be 3x. And then 3 times 4 gives us 12. Because remember, when you see that 3x, there is a multiplication sign in between it. We just tend to get too lazy to say it. In the next problem, you have 4 times p and 4 times negative 2. Yes, I know that says minus 2, but we need to read it as a negative 2. And that's going to become very important in the distributive property. So 4 times p is 4p. And 4 times negative 2 is negative 8. And as I write negative 8, it also becomes my minus sign. So I read my answer as being 4p minus 8. Let's look at this one. I have a negative 9 times y and a negative 9 times 8. Well, negative 9 times y gives me negative 9y. Negative 9 times 8 gives me negative 72. Notice I wrote down negative 72, and that ends up reading in my final answer negative 9y minus 72. In my next problem, I had negative 5 times q and negative 5 times negative 7. Negative 5 times q is negative 5q. Negative 5 times negative 7 gives me a positive 35. Guys, that last problem is where people mess up a lot, so make sure to pay attention to your signs and to see your minus as your negative. Now, here's the thing. If we can multiply out, we can also go backwards. So I could actually start with this and go to this over here. Same is true with all of these problems. You can actually go backwards. Start with this and move to this. So let's see how that would look. Here I have 8x plus 32. So what is it that I see that is in both the 8x and the 32 that I could divide out? One thing I see is a 4. But if I divide that out, if I take out that 4, I'm going to have 2x, and I'm going to have 16. But I still see a 2 in there. So let's try again, start over, and see if I can pull out anything bigger. Hey, look, I see an 8. So if I pull an 8 out, what's going to be left with that 8x? It's going to be just x. If I pull an 8 out of the second one, what's going to be left? Well, 32 divided by 8 gives me 4. Now let's double check that. If I were to distribute, 8 times x gives me 8x, and 8 times 4 gives me 32. So that really does work. What do I see over here in 5x and negative 35? Well, I see a 5. So if I pull a 5 out, 5x divided by 5 is going to leave me with x. And a negative 35 divided by 5 leaves me with negative 7. And if I distribute, I can actually double check that. 5 times x is 5x. 5 times negative 7 is negative 35. So let's check out these last two problems. What do you see in negative 6x and negative 42? Well, the first thing I see is definitely a negative on both of them. So let's pull a negative out of both of those numbers. The next thing I see is a 6. So if I pull out a negative 6, well, I would be left with x for that first number. And I would be left with a positive 7 for the second number, because I pulled out a negative 6, and a negative divided by a negative gives me a positive. And if I look at it and distribute, I'm going to see that I actually end up with negative 6 minus 42. In this final problem I have negative 9x plus 81, so what could I pull out of that? Well, I want to try, like all my other problems so far, to end up with x. So if I end up with just an x right there, I would have to pull out a negative 9. Can I pull a negative 9 out of 81? You bet. 81 divided by negative 9 actually gives me a negative 9. And if I distribute, I see a negative 9 times x gives me negative 9x, and negative 9 times negative 9 gives me a positive 81. Again, you have to watch your signs, guys.